Hello and welcome to another episode of All Fired Up with Brandon Ramsey. We're recording today's episode, as always, at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time here on Wednesday, January 8th. We are coming off of a busy night across the Southeastern Conference, and that's where we are going to be focusing a lot of our attention today. Obviously, the best conference in college basketball, a lot of big storylines that will be taking place throughout the season, but then certainly we saw some of those take shape last night as we're just getting started in conference play here to begin the new year. But as always, those of you that are joining us live here today, feel free to hop into the chat with any comments or questions that you may have. We'll get to those throughout the show. Make sure you are subscribed to us here at the Brandon Ramsey College Basketball Show YouTube channel. You can also find the Brandon Ramsey College Basketball Show on podcast, where I release episodes every Monday and Friday. Had a good one out a couple of days ago. Also, just joined the world of TikTok, where I'm posting some clips, mostly just from this show, from the podcast, but I'll have some additional gambling content, some other thoughts throughout the college basketball season. So both the Twitter account and the TikTok are at BRamseyKSR. So be sure to follow me there as well. But let's dive right into today's primary topic. And again, that's going to be life in the Southeastern Conference. We'll begin with Kentucky at Georgia. The Bulldogs got the Cats 82-69 last night. Obviously, I have plenty of thoughts on this game. Actually, did our first ever Kentucky Sports Radio watch along for this game. So I was live on YouTube throughout the game with Stephen Peak and Sean Smith. It was a lot of fun to do that format. It was admittedly less fun because we were watching a loss by the second half. I kind of wanted to log off and just watch the game, I'll admit. But no, it was still a lot of fun to chop it up with those guys throughout the game. Obviously, what we saw was a ugly basketball game. It took about 2.5 hours. Georgia shot 38 free throws. Kentucky shot 19. Interestingly enough, the foul disparity wasn't what you would expect necessarily for what I just said. Georgia just shot 38 free throws on Kentucky's 20 fouls, or on 25 fouls, excuse me. Kentucky shot 19 free throws on Georgia's 20 fouls. That's not overly shocking if you know this Georgia team. They attack the basket relentlessly off of the dribble, which leads to more shooting fouls. And they're elite on the offensive glass, which obviously makes you prone to some shooting fouls around the rim as well. So there's a time and a place for bellyaching about the refs. I'm not necessarily going to do that on this show. It's not my style. Did I think the game was officiated well? No. Do I think it was inherently lopsided in one direction? Not necessarily. I thought the whistle just could have blown more on Georgia. I thought a lot of the fouls called on Kentucky were fouls, but I just would have liked to have seen it blow a little bit more on the other end of the floor, so Kentucky would have had a chance to probably shoot some more free throws. But again, that's not the issue. I think the issue is that you're starting to see a pretty clear game plan for beating this Kentucky team. If you're able to slow the game down and make it a half-court basketball game, if you're able to be physical with the Cats, and then going hand in hand, if you're able to dominate the offensive glass, you're going to have a chance to beat them. That's what we've seen when they went to Clemson. That's what we saw when the Cats lost by 20 to Ohio State. And that's what we saw last night down in Athens against Georgia. These are teams that are going to play a little bit more of a half-court style, grind it out, lower possession games. These are teams that are going to attack the basket off of the dribble a little bit and then crash the offensive glass and make it and put Kentucky in a position where they need to be physical. And that's just not their comfortable style of play. We saw it happened in real life, folks. On Saturday, we didn't dream it. It wasn't a mirage. Kentucky beat Florida 106-100 at Rupp Arena. That really happened. Yes, they beat the same Florida team that just held Tennessee, the undefeated number one team in the country, to 43 points. That was only 72 hours before this mess of a game that we saw last night in Athens. So, big picture, I don't think there's a ton of reason for concern. But the concern would be that you're seeing a pretty clear delineation between when Kentucky is able to execute their style of play and when the opponent is quote unquote allowed to execute their style of play. I think that when Kentucky is able to play in transition, get the tempo up, shoot 30 plus threes, all of those things, I think that Kentucky has certainly proven themselves to be one of the best teams in all of college basketball. They are the only team in the country with 3 AP top 10 wins. They have still to this day one of the better resumes in all of college basketball because of the teams that they have beaten, being Duke, Gonzaga, and Florida. Now, on the other side of that, as I just mentioned, you've seen the blueprint for beating this team. It's out there now, and those losses have really looked, especially the Clemson and Georgia games, looked pretty darn similar from a Kentucky standpoint. Now, one of the things that I take away from those games, especially those two, to a lesser extent, the Ohio State game, I think that was just a lot of Ohio State's guards were better on that night. Bruce Thornton and those guys just dominated Kentucky off of the dribble. That was a little bit of a different problem. That was a very specific defensive problem. Clemson and Georgia, though, we can sit here for the next 30 minutes and we can talk about ball screen coverage. We can sit here and talk about defensive rebounding, positioning, all these sort of things. And they all matter and they're all issues for Kentucky. And there's no doubt. I mean, Coach Pope talked about it at length after the game. I can only imagine that that's a focus in the film room and on the practice floor today. But Kentucky is a top 5 offense in college basketball. They sure as heck need to be. I think that it's fair to have as many questions or concerns about the offense in these games that they've lost as the defense, because quite frankly, I expect this Kentucky team to score 80 plus every time they step on the floor. Now, let's take a pause. I know that's not going to happen necessarily. I've said it all the time. It really sometimes is as simple as when you win, you look really good, and when you lose, you play bad. That's the way that it goes. So when Kentucky loses and plays bad, they might not make it to 80. But in theory, I expect this offense to be able to produce 80 points every time they step on the floor. Georgia ended up with 82, but a few of those were in garbage time. They would have won the Clemson and the Georgia games. Kentucky would have won those 2 games if the offense operated like Kentucky offense. Now, admittedly, there's a little bit of chicken or the egg there. Some of the lack of rebounding, some of the lack of defense does lead to some of the offensive issues because you're in transition less. The game slows down. You're having to execute in the half court. You're playing from behind. And we've seen this Kentucky team, in my opinion, steer away from the plan a little too much when things aren't going well. They turn into some more one-on-one basketball, and it doesn't come from an inherently selfish place. I think it's guys wanting to make plays to help their team win the game. Just a little bit of human nature. But you do see them go away from executing the offense once they get down 5, 8, 10 points. And we certainly saw that down the stretch of last night's game. As Travis says, you can't play every game in a vacuum. Dating back to the Defiance days, Travis always loves when I talk about doing things in a vacuum. But I actually think, Trav, sort of the point is that these games are in a vacuum, and that as good as Kentucky looked on Saturday against Florida and as bad as they looked on Tuesday night against Georgia, both of those things can exist separately from each other. The Florida game still happened. We watched it with my own eyes. I was there. Last night's game still happened. It is what it is. I watched the whole thing. Those are the same basketball team. They just have nothing in common with one another. And I think that then when you're projecting forward, it's why we shouldn't sit here and pronounce the doom of the SEC schedule for Kentucky, because they could just as easily turn it around and go into Starkville on Saturday and win over Mississippi State, because how you played on Tuesday night doesn't necessarily dictate how you played on Saturday night, just as how we did last Saturday didn't dictate how we played this Tuesday. And something that I said on the KSR watch along last night on the Kentucky Sports Radio YouTube channel was, I think that this season more than any other, I know that this will sound like coach speak and this will sound like an oversimplification, and it's certainly not. I mean, it's not a strength of mine because I enjoy breaking down the film. It's part of my job to break down the film. I think a lot of Big Blue Nation, they enjoy kind of the aspect of the in the moment overreaction and all that, and that's just part of fandom. But I do think that it's a season beyond any other where you really have to evaluate just the wins and the losses. If you're a fan, decide how many SEC wins you want, whether that's 11, whether that's 13, whatever it may be. And you just have to count the wins and losses along the way because it's going to look ugly a few times along the way. You're going to lose games in the Southeastern Conference. You're going to lose several games. And when you lose them, it's going to look ugly. Then you're going to experience the highs. We've gotten already the peak and the valley of this season. Scored 106 points and beating Florida was as good as we're going to feel this season, even with getting some other big wins. Losing at Georgia is probably about as bad as we're going to feel. But you're going to experience similar feelings throughout the way. And you can't allow yourself to think we're going to the national championship game when you beat Florida. You can't allow yourself to think that we're going to go 500 in the SEC because we lost to Georgia. You just have to count the wins and the losses as 1-1 and continue to march along. And as Travis says, yeah, every game is different, has a different flow. Styles of play are different. As crazy as it seems, Florida's a heck of a lot more talented than Georgia, but the style of play of Florida fits Kentucky a lot more than the Georgia style. Like that's why I have some concerns about Saturday against Mississippi State. That's why I then unfortunately have some concerns the following Tuesday against Texas A&M. Those are teams more like Georgia stylistically than they are like Florida. But then even some of the good teams like Alabama, then you play Vanderbilt. Arkansas is going to be like this a little bit. Ole Miss, some of the teams that want to get up and down more, Oklahoma, Texas. Those are teams that I think Kentucky's going to have a lot of success against. So you can find wins even as difficult as this SEC is going to be this year. You just can't allow yourself to ride the roller coaster of emotion, or you're going to find yourself consistently being disappointed because as soon as you get high, as soon as you feel like you see the ceiling of this team, you're going to be introduced to the floor very, very quickly. And there's no better example of that, really, than what Florida did to Tennessee. From a Florida standpoint, you're coming off of a tough loss at Kentucky where I'm sure they felt like they threw their fastball for the most part. Walter Clayton Jr. comes out and scores 33 points. Elijah Martin comes out and scores 26, I believe. Those guys played incredibly well. They left some free throws on the table, certainly not shooting it well from the free throw line at Rupp Arena. But overall, Florida played excellent in that game. Kentucky was just a little bit better. Kentucky scored 106 points and was able to find a way to win. But then what do they do on Tuesday? They turn around and beat the undefeated number one team in the country by 30 points. They held, after giving up 106 to Kentucky, they held Tennessee, again, the undefeated number one team in the country, with a first-team All-American and Chaz Lanier. They held them to 43 points. Genuinely incredible what Florida did in that game. Tennessee scored 0.64 points per possession. They were 4 of 29 from 3. This is amazing. They were 8 of 27 from 2. That's under 30% for you math majors at home. It was just an all-systems failure for Tennessee. Now, I'm not going to sit here and act like I watched a bunch of the game because obviously Kentucky was going on at the same time. But honestly, the secret coming out of this game was Florida didn't play well either. Again, they only scored 73 points. They were 6 of 20 from deep. They only shot 21 of 48 from 2. So they weren't exactly on their A game in this one either. And it's so funny. And I know people watching this show, or certainly those of you among Big Blue Nation, there's a lot of people blinded by Tennessee hatred. That's not me. But there's a lot of people like that. And it's hard to say nice things about the Vols. I get it. Well, actually, I don't get it, but I get it. It seems like no matter what, there's something about wearing Tennessee across your chest that just brings out these offensive clunkers year after year. And it doesn't matter how good they are. These last couple of years, Tennessee's been one of the best college basketball teams in the country. There's no bones about it. Last year, they had a stud in Dalton Connect, a first-team All-American. This year they have a stud in Chaz Lanier, first-team All-American, that I felt like throughout the year raised Tennessee's floor offensively. And it did do that last year with Connect, and it has done that for the most part this year with Lanier. But still, no matter what, no matter how good they are offensively, no matter how good individual players they still have a couple of these clunkers every season. I mean, look back to the SEC tournament last year. The Vols scored 56 points against Mississippi State. They had a 59-point game and a loss to South Carolina last year. I know there was even a win along the way somewhere that was super ugly for them. Yeah, they had a 66-59 win over South Carolina last season. Then this year, they get along for the most. They had a 67-52 win over Norfolk State recently, but hadn't really had their big clunker. Well, here it was scoring 43, and it's just so weird that no matter what, there's just something about Rick Barnes' teams at Tennessee that because they're Tennessee, they're going to have some of these offensive clunkers. But I think it's the perfect example of you have to let these games be binary. You have to allow them to just be a win or a loss, because guess what? Tennessee's still going to win 12 or 13 SEC games this year. They don't get punished more necessarily by the fact that they lost by 30. That's going to be forgotten about by the time they take the floor the next time out. They're at Texas on Saturday. They're going to go into Austin. They're going to have a chance to win that game and get back on the horse, because and if you look in the past, they just beat Arkansas by 24 points. So again, it all goes to show that it's just the roller coaster that is the Southeastern Conference this year. You cannot allow yourself to get overly high after big wins. You can't allow yourself to get overly low after some of these losses. The other results from the Southeastern Conference last night, Mississippi State went on the road and beat Vanderbilt 76-64. That was one of two road wins. I believe Auburn also took care of business at Texas, winning 87-82. That's a game they led by much more than that at times, but Texas did a great job coming back late. Arthur Kaluma scored 34 points for the Longhorns in that one. Another National Player of the Year performance from Johnny Broome, though, for Auburn, 20 points, 12 rebounds, five assists, 3 blocked shots for Broome. So credit to those teams. We know how difficult it's going to be to win on the road, and that was one of the reasons why I thought it was important, admittedly, for Kentucky to win that one at Georgia. I know it's a quad one game still. It's likely going to stay a quad one game. They're pretty comfortably in the top 75 in the net. But you do have to think, unless Georgia's a lot better than we think, and I don't think that's going to be the case, if you don't win at Georgia, it just starts to get a little precarious when you're kind of counting through the schedule of where the road win's going to come, because you have to imagine that even if you go 8-1 at home, which is biting off a lot for this Kentucky team that has to host Alabama, has to host Auburn, has to host Tennessee still this season. But even if you go 8-1 at home, going 4-5 on the road, that gets you 12 wins. That's a great season in this year's SEC. But can you find 4 road wins if you don't win at Georgia? I think for Kentucky, you certainly still can. You can go 4-4 through the rest of the SEC road schedule, but it would have been a really nice feeling to already have one under your belt, because things certainly don't get any easier going forward. And that's why those wins, you can't discount Mississippi State going on the road and winning at Vanderbilt, or certainly Auburn going on the road and winning at Texas. Those wins are going to matter a lot as the season goes along. Tonight, you have South Carolina hosting Alabama. For the same reasons, that's a really big one for the Crimson Tide, because, again, if you don't win that game at South Carolina, where are your road SEC wins going to come from? It can start to get really tough playing that game. Oklahoma hosts Texas A&M. Oklahoma looked a little fraudulent after their 13-0 start when they lost 107-79 against Alabama. But again, now they're back home. You have to allow yourself to erase that ugly result, because if you drop one at home now to Texas A&M, then the season can start to rattle away from you in a hurry. I think those are the only games tonight, because Missouri beat LSU last night 83-67. Let's see. Oh, we'll have Arkansas Ole Miss. That's a big one. Arkansas is hosting Ole Miss tonight. Certainly a swing game, I think, for both of those teams that are probably fighting there towards the middle of the pack in the SEC. Arkansas certainly needs to get right after their loss to Tennessee. Ole Miss took care of Georgia at home on Saturday, 63-51. And I think we've now mentioned all of the results from last night and the 4 games set to take place still this evening. But just wanted to get in here and talk about how difficult this SEC race is going to be this year. I continue to say I think if you go 14-4, I think you win the league outright this year. I have a hard time imagining anybody getting through it with less than 4 losses. And honestly, I think if you go 13-5, you put yourself in a really good position to have a share of the title. That's just how difficult it's going to be. I think you're going to see a lot of 1-1 weeks for teams throughout the season. I think that anytime you go 2-0, you're going to have to feel really, really good. It does not matter who you play this year because these are all KenPom top 75 teams still. South Carolina is the lowest at 73. You're going to have teams that are playing 14 or so quad 1 games in the SEC this year. I tweeted out a list earlier today. Actually, I'll pull it up here of teams that have 3 or more quad 1 wins and no quad 2 through 4 losses. So to me, these are kind of the clean resumes with some good wins so far this season, and it's littered with several SEC teams. You have Alabama and Auburn, you have Florida, you have Kentucky, you have Oklahoma, Ole Miss, and Tennessee. So of the 14 or so, about half of them are SEC teams. Obviously, some of those teams are going to continue to rack up losses, but they're pretty much all going to be quality losses throughout the SEC schedule this year. Another quad 1 road opportunity for Kentucky coming on Saturday, as I mentioned, in Starkville against Mississippi State. So we'll see how that one goes. But thank you all for joining us live here for this week's episode of All Fired Up with Brandon Ramsey. You can certainly watch this in the future as well here on the Brandon Ramsey College Basketball Show YouTube channel. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss these live episodes or anything else coming here on the YouTube channel. Also, make sure you find the Brandon Ramsey College Basketball Show on podcast. New episodes out every Monday and Friday. And then you can follow me on Twitter and TikTok at BRamseyKSR. Thank you all for joining me here today. I hope you have a great rest of the week and have a good one.